Welcome to the Property Podcast, the home of news and debate about building long-term wealth from property investment for beginners and experts alike. And now for your hosts. They may not be as cool as me, but they do know their property. It's Rob and Rob.
Hello and welcome to episode 4 of the Property Podcast. I'm Rob Bentz and my globetrotting co-host is Rob Dix. Rob, welcome back again.
Thanks, Rob. I'm excited about this week. I'm excited about every week, but we've got a lot to pack in this time particularly. First of all, because we've got to talk about how well the podcast's doing. But then if we've got any time left after gloating, we're going to tell you the happiest place to live in the UK. And we're going to go head-to-head for what I've started calling the Landlord v Investor Smackdown. It's Rob versus Rob over 4 rounds, with me fighting the corner of landlords and Rob B arguing that we should be thinking of ourselves as investors instead. Will we find a winner? Will we still be friends afterwards? Or am I just massively overhyping the whole thing? The only way you can find out is to stick around to the end. And if you do stick around, we'll be giving you another podcast you should be checking out as well if we haven't put you off for life.
Rob's already mentioned, but the podcast has hit iTunes and we're overwhelmed with the response. We promised to mention the people who've took the time and effort to give us some nice reviews. So cue the applause, please. The list begins. Edward Lamb, thank you, says I'm a bit of a property investment newbie, so I'm really glad I found this podcast. Lots of tips, no nonsense or hard selling. Well presented too. I look forward to more future episodes. And 5 stars from Ed. There was also 5 stars from Craig Forshaw. Thank you very much, Craig. A4C also donated us 5 stars, so thank you. Bryn, 5 stars. Steve Croft, 5 stars. Practical, informative, entertaining podcast. Fantastic. Erhan, I'm new to property investment. I've just been listening to the first 2 podcasts. I've gained a heap of knowledge already. Looking forward to the next episode. Tonks, excellent podcast. He's also new, which is great. And Stan the Beginner, I'm guessing he's new. He gave us a good review too. So thanks to you to all those just mentioned. We really, really appreciate you taking the time and effort to go into iTunes and leave a review. And Rob, you've made a bit of a video, haven't you, to show people how to do this?
I have, which we'll be linking to in the show notes, which I believe you can find the show notes for this episode at thepropertypodcast.com/4, the number 4, because this is episode 4. And there's going to be a link to the little video I've done. If you're not used to using iTunes, I'm showing you how you can subscribe to make sure you'll never miss an episode, and how you can leave us a review if you're feeling nice as well.
Thank you if you have, and thank you if you intend to as well. We do appreciate it. And of course, we will mention you on the show if you take the time to do it.
We are blown away by the response we've had so far. And Rob, we need to talk about what we've done this week. And you don't want to mention the fact that you've just been on a 36-hour bender to celebrate the podcast's success, do you?
No, I didn't want to mention at all that I've just been on a stag do. So thanks, Rob. Which was good, and I can't believe I've still got my voice to talk today. But really, I've spent most of my time looking at the iTunes store, watching the ranks for the Property Podcast, which have been phenomenal. Really, really incredible, Rob.
Really amazing. I've managed to take a little bit of time to tear myself away from watching the rankings, because property-wise, I've not really been up to that much, but I've just been really busy with my day job, which is web design and copywriting. I had a really busy month with that. Also, with it being the end of the tax year, I've been messing around a bit with Xero, which is like a cloud accounting system. And so far, I'm loving it. I've imported all my bank feeds. I've been geeking out over the numbers. And I think that might be a future resource of the week when I've had a bit of a play, because it almost makes accounting fun, almost.
Oh, that's a big, big claim. But we are going to go on to talk about property now. I'd just like to say once again, we're blown away with the response to the podcast. We've shot into new and noteworthy for nearly every section we wanted. Business, investing, even all categories were in there now as well. We're overwhelmed. We don't take it for granted. So thank you for listening. Thank you for getting behind us. You've really cheered us up and made us feel like it's all been worthwhile and some. So thank you.
Thank you. And let's see if we can, with this topic for the week, keep people giving us 5 stars and keep people excited, because this week we're going to go head to head. We're going to talk about Landlord v Investor. Now, these are kind of terms that, for the purposes of this podcast, when we say landlord, we're going to be talking about someone who's got a degree of hands-on involvement in running their properties. Not necessarily doing their own repairs, but finding their own tenants and just generally being a bit hands-on. Whereas an investor, we're talking about someone who focuses on the numbers and delegates the management to someone else. Now, these terms aren't mutually exclusive, and in practice, you're both. If you're an investor, you're a landlord, and vice versa. But people tend to describe themselves as one or the other, and that kind of tells you something about how they see their role.
We're different, aren't we?
We are. We're not exactly poles apart, but you're far more the investor. I'm more hands-on. I've actually only got one property that I actively manage myself at the moment. I can see the merits in being more hands-on, and so we're going to kind of argue this out and try and determine how you should be thinking of yourself. But in practice, I think we might end up agreeing somewhere in the middle. But for the purposes of podcast entertainment, let's pretend that we're violently opposed and we're going to fight this one out. So do you want to start on your first reason why you think being an investor is the way to go?
Sure, so I'm ready to throw my first punch over the airways, Rob. My first one is, if you're an investor, you haven't got a full-time job. So what I'm implying is a landlord is a job, whereas an investor, you invest. So if you put your money into the bank, you don't go and visit the bank manager every day to see if your money's still there. Likewise, a property investor doesn't need to go and look at his property to make sure it hasn't run away. A property investor employs professionals to look after their properties for them. They look at it from afar. They're hands off. They don't get bogged down in the detail. And I'm going to give you a prime example, and Rob didn't know I had this one up my sleeve.
Damn.
Over Easter weekend, I had a friend who posted on Facebook, landlord needed desperately, tenants locked himself out, help, this is urgent. His property, he was renting out, meant that he had to spend part of his Easter weekend hunting down a locksmith, finding a good one, paying them last minute rates to come out, get the property sorted, sort out his tenants, and then get back to his weekend. If that had happened to me, which it didn't, but if it had, my letting agent would have told me what happened after the weekend. My weekend would have carried on as normal as an investor, but as he's chosen to be a landlord, and he probably will listen to this, so sorry, buddy. If he'd chosen to be an investor, he wouldn't have had that issue. So that's a prime example that shows an investor over a landlord, in that case, would have been better. Go on, Rob, beat that.
Damn it. That's a strong start. You've come out swinging with that anecdote. I was not expecting anecdotal evidence. All right, I'll try and come back. You said that being a property investor is not a full-time job. Well, I'm going to say being a landlord doesn't have to be a full-time job either. You just have to set things up properly. And if you can set things up properly, which means that you're anticipating people locking themselves out, and so you're not scrambling around for a locksmith at the last minute, you can save yourself a lot of money for not doing much work. Take the property that I manage. I'm saving 15%, say, on fully managed. That's saving me £2,500 a year. So from that, it's a case of working out my hourly rate. If I'm working tens of hours to sort things out that an agent should be doing, then okay, that £2,500 is not a great saving. But if I've managed to set things up so things pretty much run themselves, then that's basically free money. It's profit that I can use to invest into my next property. I would say that with technology as it is now, it's easier than ever to be a landlord, even if you're not there, even if you're not next door and popping around every time a light bulb goes. It's not necessarily a case of being a landlord means going around and dealing with things and knocking on the door and begging for rent every week. It's possible to still have the landlord mentality, but live more like an investor.
Rob, I think we could battle this same point over about 10 rounds, but we're going to move on. We'll let the listeners decide who wins this one.
Yeah, we'll have to.
My next point is it's easier to think bigger picture when you're an investor. So because you're not bogged down with the trials and tribulations of being a full-time landlord, you can then start to think big and look at your investments overall and decide how you're going to take things forward. So you're not dealing with the daily issues, or maybe not daily, but the issues that come up with a landlord. And so therefore, when you do spend your time on your portfolio, you're spending time on how to think big and make your portfolio big if that's what you so desire. It just means that you see your portfolio as you would any other investment, and you don't have to see it as something you need to spend your time in any great depth or detail, other than, I must say, the beginning. You do need to invest some time there, but that's like any investment. You do your research up front, make sure everything's set up front, but then once you've set that, you look big picture, and it allows you to accelerate your portfolio further and faster. Boom.
I see where you're coming from, but let me come back with this. My point would be that tenants are the essential part of your property business. If you didn't have tenants, you would not have a business. They pay your mortgage, they give you your profit. There would be no property industry if people weren't there wanting to rent your house and give you somewhere to live. Do you really want to be delegating that to a third party? If you don't get it right and you don't keep them happy, then you're just storing up problems. If they feel like there's no one looking after their interests and there's no one keeping an eye on them, they're more likely to try and get away with things. There's more likely to be damage that goes unreported, and it's just storing up problems. You could avoid that by not micromanaging, but just having a little bit more input on what's going on.
I see your point, but if you do the initial investment up front, and make sure you do have a quality agent and somebody you really trust and really value their skills and what they do, they can take that away from you. But we'll leave it there because I've got my next point for you.
Okay.
And that's you invest less emotionally when you're an investor. So because you don't need to or have to become best friends with your tenants and find out about everything that's going on in their lives, you don't feel like you owe them as much. So example, a tenant tries to play on your heartstrings and wants more help from you and more than they may deserve, but you just may feel, well, because I know them, they're almost a friend now, so I have to help them out more than I would if I didn't know them. Now, it's not to say you have to be Scrooge or a monster. I'm not advocating that. But what I'm saying is you invest more of your emotions into your property because you get to know your tenants on a deeper level. You make sure you're a great investor. I was going to use the word landlord then. On the slip of the tongue. Make sure when you invest, you give them all the things they need. You give them a good property to rent. You give them a good letting agent to manage the properties, and you look after them well, and you give them a good fair rent as well. You do all of that. It's not to say you become a monster if you become an investor, far from it. But once you've done all that and you've taken the time to make sure it's set up, then you're finished. Emotionally, it's over. You don't have to leave your heart in the property. It sounds a bit brutal, but I think it's a fair point.
I thought you'd slip there and you were going to put yourself on the floor, but actually I can't help but agreeing with you on a lot of that, especially when it comes to things like raising the rent, which is going to be a hard thing to do if you're buddies with the tenant and you're emotionally invested in it. I can't argue with that, but I will come back and say that by taking that attitude, you're missing out on the upside of tenant relationships. You're missing out on the satisfaction of providing a good service and having strong relationships. I get this with the property that I manage. We've got some lovely tenants in there, and if there's a problem, they'll email me, I'll sort it out, we'll have a bit of back and forth, and they'll be really grateful, and they'll say how that they consider themselves lucky to have a responsive landlord, and they'll tell me horror stories about the problems that their friends are having. If you're willing to put up with the downside of being emotionally involved, you do get that satisfaction that you wouldn't have if it's someone you've never met and you feel a lot more distant from.
A soft one for a fight, but it does sound good. Okay, I'm coming on for the last round, and that is, it's less intimidating being an investor. If you are building up a portfolio, a prime example would be going back to the last point. If you're building up relationships with every tenant in every property, soon that becomes hugely intimidating because it feels like you probably own more property than you actually do because you're so involved. And that's not just with the relationships, that's with the paperwork, that's with all the management. All of the above means that as your portfolio grows, it becomes more intimidating. So therefore, being an investor is less intimidating because you set your systems up, you run it like a business, you get a good portfolio, you have good tenants and good letting agents, everything's set up nicely, and therefore it doesn't feel as intimidating when you want to grow and take it to another level. So that's my final point, Rob. What have you got for me?
It's a good one. Let me try and cheat my way to a win by scaring people and saying that if you're outsourcing the management of your properties, you're leaving yourself open to selecting an agent or whoever who does not do a good job and is negligent and leaves you legally exposed, because there's all kinds of things that you need to do, things like gas and electrical certificates. There's certain standards you have to maintain. If your agent doesn't know what they're doing, they can leave you with big problems. Also, if you get into problems with your tenant and you need to evict them, if the agent hasn't set things up properly in the first place, it can be nigh on impossible to get rid of people because you haven't kept to your legal side of the bargain effectively. So the tenant can make life very difficult for you. So this is definitely a low blow from me, but I'm going to say that at least if you're looking after things yourself, you can make sure that you've done things properly and nothing's going to come back and bite you. I'm going to admit that if you select a good agent, then you don't have to worry about any of this stuff, and your point is totally valid. But how confident are you that everyone's doing what they're meant to be doing?
Rob, I can't believe you ended it with a low blow.
I was scared. What can I say? I was agreeing with you too much. I had to do it.
I'm going to call you out for a rematch already in a future episode. We'd love to hear your feedback on this and your opinions. What side of the fence do you fall on? We'll let you decide who won that battle, because this podcast will never end if we carry on. I think really we need to summarise this, and although we've both tried to push the boundaries for both, actually, I think we're in, as Rob said at the beginning, we're actually not that far away at all. You've got to take a bit of both. You can't be completely dead to your tenants and your responsibility to them, and completely switch off. You have to invest a little bit there. So maybe my point was a little unfair, but you can choose how much we've been invested. Remember the laws and regulations, so you can't switch off to that altogether. So being an investor means that you suddenly switch off to everything that you're required to do. It's taking the best of both, and hopefully that will allow you to build a successful portfolio. Would you agree, Rob?
Boringly, yes, I would. Let's touch gloves and agree to agree, really, because, I kind of lend a bit more towards being a landlord. But even if you decide to try and save yourself some money and do things yourself, I'd still say that you should be delegating a lot of stuff. Like, is the best use of your time is probably not going and attending to every minor repair, and it's not chasing up rent. It's have systems, have tradesmen who you call on when you need them, put people on direct debits, and just have everything systemized. So even if you don't want to fork out 15% for an agent, you can delegate to someone and just give them your systems and get them doing it far cheaper. And then as you scale, it becomes more and more important to either have systems in place yourself or pass it all over to someone else. But you definitely don't want to be getting too bogged down in the colour of tiles in your bathroom and forget the fact that you need to be thinking about scaling your portfolio up, where you should be investing, what's happening with your mortgages, and big picture.
Let's move on to the news article that's caught our attention this week, and it's been a little bit slow because of Easter, but there was a nice soft story after a fight. It's always nice to go to something a bit more fluffier, and we're looking at the UK's happiest place to call home.
We are, and I knew there was something up with me for the last couple of weeks. I've found out that I'm living in the least happy place in the whole of the UK. East London, 110th.
Yeah. Well done, Rob. So when you move back to the UK, you managed to single out the most unhappy place.
Picked a winner there.
Now, I'm sure if you're in the East End, you'll disagree. This isn't our survey, I'd like to point out, because also in the bottom 10 is North London, where I used to live, and my office is currently based. So I'm not sure it dropped into the bottom 10 when I opened up the office, but that didn't do too well. Harrogate, lovely part of the world, came number 1, and Stockport, Ipswich, Exeter, and one of my favourites, St Albans, in the top 5. It's been a quiet week in the news, but that's a nice story that Rightmove put out a few days back.
It is, and the funny thing is how close together a lot of the best and worst places are. So if you're living in southeast London or Croydon, then you can just move a few miles to Kingston upon Thames and your life is about 100 places better.
Yeah, it's that easy. So a short commute and suddenly you've got a happy life. I'm sure it is that easy, thanks to Rightmove.
Sure it is.
Okay. Where are we, Rob? Let's go to our resource of the week. Now, I've picked this one because I'm a big fan of his podcast, Pete Matthews' Meaningful Money podcast. It's a few episodes further in than our own, and it's a slightly different subject. It's looking at IFA and saving and investing, more general, so we're property. But I thought it'd be good to give you a good IFA's podcast, and believe me, IFA doesn't always make you think excitement and entertainment, and I'm not saying that we are, but Pete Matthew does a fantastic job, and I'm not long listened to episode 8, which I thought was excellent, which was how to choose an IFA. Not only does he make it fun and give some good advice, he comes across as a great guy. I don't know him, but really like the podcast. He's done really well in the charts as well. So check his podcast out, Meaningful Money Podcast. He's also got a YouTube channel, which is really good, and that's been going strong for years. Take a look at that, and if you leave a review for him, let him know how you found him.
I hadn't heard of it, but I'm going to go and download that right now and add that to my list. You know what? We should probably link up a few of our other favourite podcasts as well, because maybe we're arrogant enough to think that people are discovering podcasts for the first time through us, but it is amazing when you start digging into it just how much great stuff there is. There's just brilliant content around would be like far too much niche topics to be on the radio or anything, but there's brilliant content you can listen to in your car or when you go for a run or whatever. So we should link up a few of our favourites and give people some other stuff to explore.
We love podcasts. I know we've mentioned that we're both bookworms, but we also are podcast addicts as well, so we can give you a big list. So we'll probably put that in a resource on the website. Have a look. If you go to thepropertypodcast.com/4, that's the number 4, you'll be able to find all these resources that we mentioned mentioned this week. They'll all be there for you so you can get easy access to them.
While you're there, join the mailing list, which lots of people have done already, and it just means that we'll send you an email every week when a new episode comes out to make sure you never miss anything. And on that note, we should probably wrap up, Rob, shouldn't we?
Yeah, it's been a good episode. I've enjoyed that. It's nice to not agree for a whole episode, so I'm sure the listeners agree too.
Bit of light sparring is always a winner. And then next week, we're going to be talking about how to choose a letting agent. So that kind of assumes that you've won and you're going to want a letting agent so you can concentrate on being an investor and seeing the big picture. But that's okay. I'm sure we've got lots of great tips about how to make sure you leave your property interests in a safe pair of hands.
Yeah, make sure you find us next week because we've got some real actionable advice that you can take and some real good tips that I use all the time to pick out letting agents. So there'll be some really good actionable advice that you can put into action straight away. So make sure you join us next week for that one.
All right, so thank you very much for listening. We'll see you next week.
Super. Thanks a lot, everyone. Bye, Rob.
Bye.
Thank you for listening to the Property Podcast. Don't forget to check out the show notes and join the mailing list at thepropertypodcast.com.